Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look then at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with Sonia Soda, the chief lead writer at The Observer, and Mark Wallace, the chief executive of the Total Politics Group. Welcome and good evening to both of you. So let's take a look at the front pages, shall we? Starting with the arrest and later release of the treasurer of the Scottish National Party. It's the lead for the Scotsman with the headline SNP crisis deepens after second arrest. The NHS is broken, the Telegraph quotes the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who says a fifth of A&E patients are going to hospital because they can't get to see their GP. The case of Damien Bendel, who was released from jail after probation officers said he was low risk, but who then killed his pregnant partner and 3 children, is the lead story for the Metro. The Mirror leads with what it calls the 5 Tory broken promises on outlawing zombie knives and machetes that mean children are still dying. The attack by eco-protesters on the World Snooker Championships leads The Sun with demands that the venture capitalist's son who led it faces what the paper calls tough justice. While the Mail asks when somebody will get a grip on what it calls the eco-fanatics, or when will someone get a grip, rather. The Financial Times leads with an 18% slump in profits as US Bank Goldman Sachs after an unsuccessful move into consumer banking. And the Daily Star reports that the boss of Google is worried about the possible dangers of artificial intelligence, even though he admits he doesn't fully understand it. He's not alone. A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's head to our guest then. Sonia, do you mind picking up? I don't know if you heard what Mark had to say, but anyway, take it away.
I did hear some of what Mark was saying, and I think there's been, it's a massive issue for the SNP. It's Humza Yousaf, his first few weeks in the job, and this is the second arrest of a very senior SNP official. Today we found out that he, the treasurer, has also been released without charge, in the same way that the treasurer, Peter Murrell, who was married to Nicola Sturgeon, former First Minister of Scotland, he was also arrested and released without charge. But there are very serious questions overhanging the SNP around its finances, around what happened to the resources that were raised for an independence campaign, how they were spent, were they spent on that campaign, were they spent on something else? Very serious questions as well around a motorhome that was apparently bought as a battle bus for use during lockdowns, except there weren't any lockdowns after it was bought. And it was apparently left parked in front of Peter Murrell's mother's house. So it all looks quite serious to the SNP. It's obviously a very complicated investigation. It's an investigation about any potential financial misconduct in the party. So it will probably take a number of weeks to play out. But the SNP are also without auditors, which is very serious for a political party. So we know its auditors resigned towards the end of last year. It's not been able to appoint new auditors, and it needs to be filing accounts with the Electoral Commission in July. So all in all, it's really not a good situation for the SNP in the first few weeks of Humza Yousaf's tenure as First Minister of Scotland.
And certainly 2 of the others who had stood to be leader, Kate Forbes and Ash Regan, speaking out today. Certainly Kate Forbes suggested that the allegations about the party's finances were mind-blowing. And the Telegraph reporting, I don't know if we can go to Mark, maybe we'll try again, that the SNP is turning on Humza Yousaf because he won't suspend Nicola Sturgeon as an MSP. Is that a necessary step, Mark, do you think?
It's taking part of this challenge. The one person we haven't heard a huge amount from about this is, of course, the former First Minister herself. We all remember when she did decide to step down. It wasn't a hugely interesting account as to why she decided at that moment. But I think we need to hear more from her, really, about exactly what led to that, what she knew and didn't know the situation. Humza Yousaf can have an easy right if he decides to or not.
Mark, I think we need to reboot you. Not you, obviously, but your sound. So I'm going to move on, if you don't mind, and head to Sonia with the Daily Mail. We've clearly seen a number of protests against sporting events, Sonia. When will someone get a grip of the eco-fanatics? That's the front page of the Daily Mail, as protesters prepare to descend on London this weekend, the weekend of the London Marathon.
Well, this seems to be a bit of a perennial story when you've got a period where eco-protesters are sort of protesting the climate crisis and climate change. The government always weighs in and says, well, clearly the law isn't strong enough, we need to do something. I'm not so sure about that. We know these protests can be extremely disruptive, but there's lots of laws that are already designed to deal with very disruptive protests. So, for example, you've got public order offences, for example. So this always, to me, has a bit of a ring of the government trying to look like it's doing something at a time when it knows there's going to be lots of unpopular disruption. When you take a step back, I'm really not sure what these protests are achieving, because we already know, when you look at the polling evidence, the public are concerned about the climate crisis. And I'm not sure that actually by disrupting very popular big events like the Grand National, like big snooker events, like potentially the marathon, I'm not sure what exactly the protesters' objectives are, really, because I'm not sure that that's what's going to win round greater public support and public pressure for the government to act.
Yes, and Rishi Sunak, the Mail telling us, vowing to bring in tougher laws to stop protesters ruining great British sporting events with their selfish and reckless behaviour. They've talked about this before, haven't they, Sonia? We'll wait and see if it happens.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm pretty sceptical, as you probably heard in my voice just there, Anna, because I think these laws already exist to deal with disruptive protests. And in fact, in the last couple of years, the government has passed even stricter laws around protests, giving the police more powers. This, to me, always has the feel of the government sort of saying it's going to do something when actually I'm not sure that new laws are needed. It's more about effective policing.
Just the Times is just in, Sonia. I'm going to stay with you. Apologies to Mark. We are trying to fix his sound, or he is. I don't know. It might be an internet connection his end. I don't know. But anyway, the Times is just in, and it's decided to go with the Fox News defamation, Dominion voting systems settlement in Delaware. The breaking news from earlier, $787.5 million it's cost them. It was a $1.6 billion lawsuit. But clearly this is very significant and in some respects has disappointed social media, who wanted to unpick this properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really big settlement, as you just said there, Anna. And there were a lot of people who've been waiting a long time for this case, because I think if it hit the courtroom, there were going to be absolutely explosive allegations made against Fox News in terms of what its news executives did and did not know to be the truth about the election. Obviously, Fox News coverage played a big role in the fallout after President Trump lost the election and in the insurrection on Capitol Hill on January the 6th. Fox News sort of supported President Trump's claims that the election was fixed. And this is one of the companies that owns some of the voting machines, Dominion, suing for defamation in the US courts. Now, we were really getting close to the wire. This was about to be heard in a courtroom. A jury had even been picked, but then this very big settlement was reached at the last minute. It may not be the end of the story, though, because there are other outstanding lawsuits. In fact, there's another company that owns voting machines that has got a case currently working its way through the legal system against Fox. So we're going to have to wait and see whether Fox decides to settle that in the same way, or whether it goes through what would be a lengthy court battle, which I think would involve some quite explosive revelations, is likely to, in a US courtroom.
Yes, so Fox News facing another court hearing in New York, but also Dominion suing other media companies as well. And let's head to prepayment meters, shall we? Obviously, there's been a lot of reporting on this in various newspapers, including The Times. Crackdown on prepayment meters. The code bans the forcible installation for over 85s. The charities, of course, calling the voluntary rules too soft. Where do you stand?
Well, I agree with them. So it's a new voluntary code that's being suggested by Ofcom, the energy regulator. It comes after those really terrible revelations about energy companies using some sort of debt collection companies, sort of bailiffs, essentially forcing their way into people's properties, installing prepay meters in some very vulnerable households. So households with very young children, households with disabled people who really cannot be without heat, and then also older households. Now, what Ofcom are proposing here, it's a voluntary code, first of all, and charities have got an issue with that, consumer charities, because we've had lots of voluntary codes. And, it turned out that energy companies were sort of flaunting them in order to put in these prepayment meters. And it's a voluntary code that only applies to the 85s and over. And it sounds like the terminally ill. And charities are asking the question, who's going to regulate this voluntary code? How do you prove that you're terminally ill? What about people living with, for example, long-term disability? What about households with very young children? So I think charities are right to be concerned that if it's just a voluntary code and if there are some it's quite tightly prescribed, there's a real risk that, again, energy companies just kind of interpret the rules very flexibly, and you have bailiffs forcing their way into vulnerable people's houses to install these prepayment meters for people who just simply cannot afford to be cut off from energy for health reasons, or because, for example, they've got tiny babies in their households.
And go to the Financial Times. Rishi Sunak, aware perhaps of what Labour is doing with a business reset planned. What are you hearing?
Well, this is really interesting. There are two big things happening in this story. First is that the Prime Minister has been beefing up his team in terms of their experience and expertise in Downing Street for the people doing liaison and outreach to business. And second, he's launched what's effectively a charm offensive, really trying to get on the front foot and trying to press the flesh and win over business people. This, of course, is meant to be his strong point. It was meant to be, as the former Chancellor, one of the areas where he would be ahead to start off with. What this is really is in reaction to several months now of growing Conservative concern about the way in which Team Starmer have upped their game on this front. Even back at the party conference season, I remember speaking to lobbyist after lobbyist, company after company, who were saying they were very impressed for the first time, really back since Ed Balls used to do this, almost a decade ago now, at how Labour had turned things around, and they were getting loads of shadow cabinet FaceTime, which flattered them. And every time they met people, they were saying, "We're here to listen to what you want," which also contrasted quite sharply with what they were sometimes getting from government ministers. So this is the Conservatives trying to to compete with obviously what they see as a growing challenge.
Yes, and the FT suggesting that Labour's expecting to sell out its business events at this autumn's annual conference in Liverpool. Concerted on health too, possibly. If we take a look at the Daily Telegraph, the NHS is broken. Sir Keir Starmer saying that the problem is, of course, that people can't get to a GP's appointment, so they're sent to A&E, and a fifth are now going to hospital, which obviously blocks up emergency care.
Yes, that's right. So this is a big intervention from Keir Starmer on the NHS. I'm sure people won't be surprised to see this headline, the NHS is broken. I think lots of people are aware of what's going on, because when they try and use health services, they face huge delays. I think actually, when it comes down to it, when we take a step back, one of the big issues is we don't spend enough on healthcare in this country. So we do spend less than particular countries in Europe, for example, countries like Austria, like Germany, which are countries that have more doctors per head than we do, more hospital beds per head. There's different ways of funding your health system, but ultimately we're not really spending enough, considering that we're an ageing society, the pace of medical technology changing, which means that as societies get richer, they tend to spend more of their GDP on healthcare, and we just haven't been keeping pace, and that's true. If you look at the rises that the NHS has historically had year on year, that tailed off from 2010 onwards due to public spending cuts. And it's true if you look at international comparisons as well. So it's not just money, but at the moment, we're not putting enough money into healthcare. We're spending too much on acute services and not enough on prevention, not enough on primary care, not enough on the sort of healthcare that stops people needing to go into hospital for that acute care in the first place. And then the problem is that once you get a system in which there are delays and waiting lists are, at record highs at the moment, partly as a result of the pandemic, but partly, I think, because of over a decade of underfunding of the NHS, relative underfunding. The issue is that when you've got people waiting longer for operations, their health conditions have to get worse before they get treated by the NHS. That's worse for them in terms of their long-term health outcomes, but it's also worse in the long term as well, because once your condition gets worse, it tends to be more expensive to treat. So, we've really got a system that isn't working well at the moment. And for me, underfunding, if you look at the international comparisons, if you look at the fact that we have far fewer doctors, nurses, hospital beds per head, that resourcing is very much part of it.
And just quickly, Mark, it's not the first time that Sir Keir Starmer, or indeed Wes Streeting, the shadow on health, has talked about reform, going back to or making the case for neighbourhood health services. It feels a bit like cottage hospitals in some respects to me, which are, some of which have been wiped out. Just very quickly, is reform what is required now?
I think you will obviously need some form of reform. I mean, my colleagues at the House magazine published an investigation yesterday that found, I think, 250,000 children had been turned down effectively for mental health care after being referred by their GPs, by NHS Trust. There's a whole litany of these problems. The question is, what kind of reform is Keir Starmer going to propose? And will any of the unions wear it? Neighbourhood healthcare system used to have GPs that would go around to people's houses, do out-of-hours calls. That was effectively scrapped in a contract negotiation. I don't hear the BMA rushing to reinstate stuff like that.
OK, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Yes, reform, even if required, is exhausting for an overworked workforce, certainly. Both of you, thank you both very much indeed.